So what does it mean then? Freedom from conditioning. When that conditioning is held in my brain, in the memory, as a fact. Can I look at that conditioning? It throws up its response into the memory. Do I have to identify with that response and call it my response? Or can I watch it and have the freedom to accept it or not accept it? I think that's freedom. Freedom from conditioning means you are not so attached, you are not so addicted to your conditioning that you must necessarily accept the opinions which it is throwing up into your brain. After all, when my friend gives his opinion, he gives from his conditioning. I don't always accept that opinion. And when my child wants something, he says, I want an ice cream. I look at what he is saying, and sometimes I get him the ice cream, and another time I feel, no, this is not the appropriate time, or you are ill, you should not be having that. And I say, no, not today, you can't take it. Can I treat myself like my child? Can I look at this desire which comes up, saying, I want ice cream, not identify it, not make it my mission to fulfill every such reaction which arises from my own conditioning. Watch it and see, and have the freedom to fulfill it if I want to fulfill it, or not fulfill it if it is not appropriate at that time. Then I think that is freedom. Freedom from desire, or freedom from your conditioning, that you are not completely identified with it. You can watch that reaction. You can't help that, perhaps, because that reaction is arising from your memory, and you have no way that that memory can be erased. But why should I identify myself? So what I'm trying to say is that just as there is a body, and the body has a certain structure, in the same way, the memories in the brain have a structure, a certain form. I mean, my memories are different from your memories, because your past is different from mine. Your training is different from mine. What you learnt in school, the subject, your capacities are different from mine. But the attachment which I have to this me, the importance which I give to that me, that constitutes what we call the ego. So it's not that the memories in themselves are a problem, but the fact that I identify with them and call that the me, and then make it a mission to fulfill and promote the me, all that constitutes the ego process within us. And therefore, as I understand it, the ego is an illusion. It is a creation, it's an assumption. It's the identification with the me and the mine. So I have called this country mine, and I have great feeling for this country, but I look upon another country as separate from me. That's nationalism. And that's just a learnt thing. It's the fact that I was born in that country which is called India. I can't change that fact. But nationalism is not a fact. It's a response from within me, which is a learned response. And if that leads to war, can I give up that response? I can't give up the fact that I was born in Madras. That's a fact. A biological, natural fact. You can't change that. But the approach to it, the psychological approach to it, doesn't have to be accepted. So self-knowledge has two components to it. One is to discern what is true and what is false in your conditioning, because you may have grown up with all kinds of false notions. And all those illusions in the mind, they produce fear, they produce hatred, they produce division, and all kinds of consequences which are negative emotions. And therefore, one can free oneself of that by dropping those illusions. Dropping those illusions actually changes the memory content, because Earlier, let's say you were comparing yourself with other human beings because you were brought up with the feeling of competition and all the time being compared with others and so on. But you, through watching, through this kind of inquiry, you learn, why do I compare? And I watch what are the consequences of comparing myself with others. And I realize that through comparison, there is the feeling of inferiority, superiority, there is jealousy, there is envy, there is hierarchy, somebody seems to be high up and this man seems to be low. All that comes from comparison. And there is a lot of discrimination, lot of division produced by that comparison, and a lot of negative emotions also coming from there. So is it possible not to compare? Now you stay with that question. And if you can see that comparison is like a disease of the mind and it makes my life very complicated, unnecessarily, it drops away. So when it drops away, it's like breaking a habit. It's like dropping smoking or dropping drinking because you've seen that it's hurting you. You drop it. So in the same way, it may be difficult, but it's possible. The human being has this capacity to break habits. So can I break this habit in me of comparing myself with other people and therefore having these comparative reactions which come from comparison with others? That's a big load off your mind, and that's possible. So that's the fact that I believe that comparison is necessary, comparison is normal, etc., was just a cultural thing because I was brought up with comparison. But I can drop it and free myself of that. All that is part of self-knowledge. Similarly, one can free oneself of these notions of women must do this or not do this and so on, or notions of sexual morality and so on. They are changing. But to become aware of the fact that these are just subjective, that I have grown up that way, therefore I feel that way. And there is no great truth about it. It's a relative truth because I feel it's true because I was brought up that way. Just as I like certain food because I was brought up with it, and the other man likes a different kind of food because he grew up with it and his brain is trained differently for a different kind of food. It's just like that. And so you are not attaching to it moral notions and feeling of superiority or inferiority. Then you see that only as a difference between two people, and it doesn't create a division. So all the enmity, the feeling of separateness does not come just because the skin color is different, or the place where the person was born is different, or the way he prays to God is different, and so on. You just see it as a difference, natural difference, and it doesn't produce any division or enmity or hatred out of it. So a lot of these cultural illusions can be dropped through such investigation for oneself. But thought is not a very good instrument for this investigation. And we should really go into this nature of thought and where thought is useful and what is the danger of using thought in this inquiry. Of course, in order to communicate this inquiry, like what I am doing now, I use thought. I have to use language. So for communication, thought is necessary. I have to verbalize what the meaning I am wanting to convey and express it as a thought. You listen to that thought and you interpret the meaning of it. And that's how meaning gets communicated from one person to another. So that is the function of thought. But if you use thought for the quest for truth, then because thought is a response from memory, and memory contains all these particular illusions with which one has grown, thought is a conditioned instrument. The Christian thinking is different from the Muslim thinking, is different from the Hindu thinking, and so on. The same event produces different reactions and different kind of thoughts in the mind of different people. So, thought is a colored instrument. Thought is not an instrument for arriving at the truth. It is an instrument for communication. It is also an instrument for creating the question in the mind and communicating the question from one person to another. But you cannot, if you use it to answer that question, then it becomes simply an intellectual answer, and that answer is coming from your particular conditioning. Or is it coming from a perception? So that's the question one has to ask for oneself. The intellectual understanding is not the same thing as the realization of a truth. That's why the professor of Buddhist philosophy is not the Buddha. He doesn't have the wisdom of the Buddha. He doesn't share the consciousness of the Buddha. He has merely intellectually understood what the Buddha is pointing out, and he can describe it to the students, which is a useful thing for communication. But he is not the Buddha. What's the difference between the Buddha and the professor of Buddhist philosophy, who can explain everything which the Buddha spoke, and he can speak also? But he is a professor of Buddhist philosophy. He is not the Buddha, because he doesn't have that consciousness. So the knowledge of the truth does not transform consciousness. And that's why we are saying here, the role of the Guru, that he can give you the knowledge, he can give you the question, but he cannot give you the truth. And so also the book. The book cannot give you the truth, because truth lies at the level of perception. So that's why you have to be a light unto yourself in this quest for truth. In the scientific quest, that is not true. We had discussed that the other day. And we said that in the scientific quest, this perception or insight is needed only by the first discoverer of a new paradigm. But after that, he explains it and puts it in logic and in mathematics and so on. And other people can use this logic and insight to use science. And they don't necessarily need to have the same perception or the same insight as the original discoverer did. But in the religious quest, in this quest for self-knowledge, without your own perception, there is no transformation of consciousness, because the illusion doesn't end. The professor of Buddhist philosophy is not having love, compassion, non-violence. He's not freed his mind of comparison and so on. He's just the same as other human beings, but he has all this knowledge of what the Buddha has talked about and so on. So one has to be very careful that one is not mistaking merely an intellectual answer to be the truth. We went the other day into what is the nature of religious truth, and we said that religious truth is not an idea which can be propagated. It is at the level of perception. And there you have to perceive what is true for yourself, so that the false ends, so that there is an actual transformation in consciousness, because now I don't respond with that illusion, out of that illusion. And that reaction is now missing. So I am no longer responding to life in exactly the same way as I was responding before I had this perception. That's the nature of self-knowledge. The greatest barrier to self-knowledge and this learning is the ego process within us, which is the attachment to all this personality traits which are stored in the memory in the brain. And as we have just seen, they are just a accidental thing. If you were born in a different family, in a different country, you would be programmed differently. And therefore, to give tremendous importance to this program and to identify with it and feel the importance of it, that I am American or I am Christian and this and that, that's what gives you a feeling of individuality. But to see it only as something that I have acquired from my birth. Like you see the kind of food you eat, you don't feel superior to another, the Chinese, just because he eats different food, right? But you feel superior when, because of ability or because of moral notions and so on, that those people are immoral, we are moral people and so on. So this value judgments, when we attach value judgments to differences, then it creates division. But when there is no measurement, no value judgment, then you perceive a difference only as a difference, and it does not produce enmity. So it's very subtle. And it needs a lot of observation to discover that for oneself and not simply accept it as Krishnamurti's opinion or an idea that Krishnamurti has given, and since he was a very wise man, this must be true. That kind of acceptance on authority is not self-knowledge. It's still only knowledge. The knowledge of what Krishnamurti has pointed out is trivial, is as trivial as knowledge, any other knowledge, as far as transformation of consciousness is concerned. Which is why he kept on saying, don't accept what I say. Investigate it. Stay with the question. Observe in your own life, and through observation discover whether this is true or not. Because then when you discover for yourself, then that truth becomes yours. Otherwise, it is just an idea of a truth which somebody else perceived and you don't know whether that is true. In which case it does not end the illusion and does not transform consciousness within us. So that's a work which each one of us has to do. To learn about oneself is to distinguish between what is true and what is false, to retain the true and to drop away the false. And the mechanism for that is that whenever one sees a negative emotion arise, like anger or jealousy or hatred or conflict, that conflict is informing me, Krishna, there is still some illusion somewhere in your mind from where this is arising. Find out what it is and get rid of it. That's the work that one has to do. And there are pointers to it, because the conflict, the jealousy, the anger is very perceptible. And when that arises, normally I deal with it externally, but it's also a great opportunity to learn for oneself and free oneself of that reaction, because that reaction arises out of illusion, not out of facts. Facts don't divide us. It is illusion always that divides us. And that is this learning of self-knowledge, which ultimately leads to wisdom. So, self-knowledge is the key to wisdom. Whether you will become completely free or not, who knows? I mean, even to think that Krishnamurti was completely free, somebody else may not agree with that, may say that no, he was still with conditioning. How would you prove that it was so, and why should you prove? So that's not the point. The point is that we are capable of this inquiry. We are capable of discovering these truths for ourselves. We are capable of transformation of our consciousness to whatever extent we are able to inquire into it and learn for ourselves. And this learning is very different from the accumulation of knowledge, which is normal part of education. And this learning, therefore, one has to do for oneself. Education should at least point out to the child this learning and the necessity for this learning. In fact, once Krishnamurti was asked, Sir, why is it so difficult to understand your teaching? And he said, there is no such thing as my teaching, sir. You don't have to understand the teaching. You have to understand yourself. The entire purpose of what I am saying is to make you realize the importance of understanding yourself. Full stop. So it's not a question of understanding what Krishnamurti has written, what does he mean by observer is observed. If it's your question, you want to understand it, that's different. But to understand what Krishnamurti meant by it is just philosophy. You will come to know, you will interpret the meaning in a particular way of it. That is not the same thing as discovering the truth which he is trying to point out. So he is trying to convey or communicate a truth which he has arrived upon. But he has arrived at it through his perception, and I make it into an idea, and that idea I mistake for the truth. Then it's an illusion. When you mistake an idea in your mind as, accept it as an answer, it becomes an illusion. So it's important to doubt that. And the way to know whether one has really had perception or one is only intellectually doing it is to watch your consciousness. In the consciousness, if there is still hatred, still jealousy, still anger, still conflict, then you have not understood. You have not perceived for yourself. And therefore, you need to work at it. You need to investigate those questions and not constantly live with the answers of your intellectual inquiry of yesterday. Normally, we are all taught to stay with opinions. We stay with a lot of opinions which have come from our past, previous, and then you argue with the other person and so on. That's not at all a process of dialogue or of this inquiry. In fact, in the afternoon, we will go into it as to what is this art of dialogue, which Krishnamurti pointed out that though each one has to do this for himself in the sense that you have to be alive to yourself, because we share the same consciousness, in the sense that desire has the same reason, arises for the same reasons in you as it does in me. And it has the same consequences in you as it does in me. And therefore, we can both together understand what desire is, because we share the same consciousness, just as we share the same body, essentially. Share in the sense that the body functions, it's identical, it functions the same way. The cause and effect relationships in the body, in my body is the same as in your body, and in your consciousness is the same as in mine. So though I can't observe what is going on in your consciousness, when I observe mine and I learn through observation, through my inquiry, and discover a truth for myself, I have also understood the way your consciousness functions, because your consciousness does not function differently from mine. It's the same as the human consciousness, which is universal. And the fact that we feel we have separate consciousnesses is because of this attachment to the memories of the me. And if you see the falseness of that, then that importance dies away. And this identification with the me and the mind dies away. And then the ego, if it doesn't disappear completely, certainly it is no longer a strong factor in your life. If it doesn't disappear, you have to persist with watching it. And when you learn the danger of approaching life in that egotistic way, it will drop away. I call it an approach because the ego is an approach. It is not an actual thing which exists in our body like our stomach or our heart or our lungs. It's not something that nature has put there. It is a construct. Therefore, it's an illusion. Let me explain that. You can play a game, let's say a game of football or soccer, whatever you want to call it, and give tremendous importance to winning that game. Then you are playing egotistically, and it will have its consequences, that when you lose, you will feel frustrated and you will feel rivalry towards the opposite team, and you will be happy if he slips and falls, and so on. So all kinds of negative emotions come out of that egotistic approach. But if you don't give importance to whether you are going to win or lose, the better team will win, and that's the right thing that will happen, and whatever is the right thing is fine with me. But I enjoy the game. There is the joy of playing. So the joy of that activity is not ego, but the achievement, the importance of the achievement of the result becomes the ego. So that's why this whole motive with which you are playing determines whether you are playing egotistically or non-egotistically. When you play the game non-egotistically, you can play equally well because you want to excel. Excellence for its own sake, for the love of it. And the other team wins, or your friend wins with whom you are playing. And there is no frustration, there is no unhappiness, there is admiration for the opponent because he played so well. You go and congratulate him, you say, I would like to play more, I would like to learn further, I enjoyed the game playing with you. There is none of those negative emotions arise because you are not approaching the activity in an egotistic way and not seeking some result or profit out of it for yourself.